Okay, in this chapter, now following up on what we had done for the consumer, now we're talking about the firm. And the firm's objective, as you probably remember from the principles class, is that the firm again is trying to maximize their profit levels. Okay, so if they're trying to maximize profits, that means that they're trying to maximize the difference between total revenue and total cost, where the total revenue is simply the price times the quantity. So we're taking that minus the total cost, and that's equaling my profit levels, which I'll, throughout this lecture, summarize as just the symbol for pi, which is ideally what economists use to describe profit. So total revenue minus total costs equal profit. So what we want to do is create then a discussion of how this looks like from the long run and the short run perspective. Interestingly enough, you actually looked at this already in your Principles of Microeconomics course in terms of the short run. What we're adding to this discussion is the long run discussion. And the really cool thing about this is that you've actually just learned in Chapter 4 what this long run framework is going to look like, because it's it's the same structure as it is for the consumer. Okay, so let's start. So we start out with our discussion with the production function, that the output levels are a function of the amount of capital and the amount of labor. So with these two inputs, they're combined in such a way to produce the outputs. Outputs are a function of the inputs. And when we say function of, we mean the way in which inputs are combined. What is that? That would be technology, that would be processes. There's a way in which the two inputs, capital and labor, are combined to make an output. As I said here, we're going to talk about both the short run and the long run. How long the long run is, how short the short run is, that's not important. And what we're really talking about here is that something is short run when some of the inputs are fixed. When all the inputs are variable, then we are talking about the long run. So let's talk about how inputs can be fixed. Most of the time, at least in the United States, we talk about capital being the fixed input. I am making this lecture right now in the E building on the UH West Oahu campus. Okay, so this is a building. It's a building owned by the state. There's not too much, that can really happen in the course of this next year with this building. This is a building designed for faculty offices and for classrooms, and so it's kind of a fixed input in the production of classes, right? But we would imagine over a very long period of time, there could be a point where we say, let's just tear this building down and create something new, or create nothing at all. Now we're talking about the long run. Or, in the curious case for some, especially when the labor is, most of the time the labor is considered variable in the short run, because you can fire and hire workers at will for most employees. Now, that's not always the case, though, especially if the employee is unionized, then they are actually the fixed input. And then, obviously, what changes is that eventually that collective bargaining agreement expires. Something changes that then makes that labor input then variable in the long run. Okay. So now we need to talk about how productive the inputs are. Well, we can talk about this from three perspectives: total production, average production, and then the marginal production. The total production is rather easy to understand because that's just the production function that we're accustomed to seeing, where I have the inputs and they give me a production function based on how they could technically be combined to produce the output. Then the other way I could do this would just be to say I could take my total amount of output and I could just divide it by the number of workers. Or I could take my output and divide it by my amount of capital. And I could do these things to get my average product. My marginal product would be my change in output for change in number of workers change in output for change in the number of capital. That way I can see how productive each additional unit of capital is and how productive each additional worker is. That's going to be my marginal product. This is focused on the change amounts. This is focused on total amounts, which are derived from that. Okay, so we could obviously do a very easy function that if I had 5 units of labor and I produced 150 units, that 150 divided by 5 is 30. That would be my average product of capital. I could do the same for capital items as well. When we graph this out, interestingly, what we see, and you should be familiar about this from your principles class, is that the total product curve initially is increasing at an increasing rate and then increasing at a decreasing rate. It's getting steeper and steeper, flatter and flatter, which is exactly what the marginal product of labor does. It's the slope of the total product curve. And you see here that the magnitude of the slope is initially getting higher and higher and higher. And then it transitions from workers becoming more productive to less productive, which then means that my marginal product of labor starts to fall. It then reaches a peak and then actually starts to decline. Notice that there's a difference between saying that there's decreasing marginal returns and negative marginal returns. Decreasing marginal returns to labor means I get more work out of each worker, just not as much as I used to. What this is saying is that adding more workers actually lowers my production. What causes these areas? Well, here what we're saying is that we get more specialized labor. Workers become more and more productive, and so they can focus on certain things. What tends to happen here is you get overly specialized. What would that look like? Well, before I taught at University of Hawaii, I actually used to teach at University of Wisconsin, very big institution, and every semester I would teach. Almost all of my teaching duties were devoted to a single course. And there were entire faculty members hired just to teach a single course. In some sense, we were overly specialized because then all of my battles in the department, everything I thought about the curriculum, everything I thought about everything about economics was just one course. It's an overly closed point of view. I still could teach a lot and I could do it very well, but maybe not for the department as a whole, because I was just focused on one class. What happens here? Here, you've got, I don't know, vandals, cheating, things that happen in very big organizations right? Like, we could imagine that if any company that has hundreds of thousands of employees, there's going to be some workers who are phantom workers who don't really work there, but the system is so big that they somehow get a paycheck for not doing actual work, right? We kind of hear these like kind of stories, urban myths about these things. And so we see actually production going down as we add more and more workers. The organization becomes more complex. And that's where you see the marginal product actually becoming negative here. So now we get back to the managerial part of this course. What is the manager to do? Well, the manager obviously has to then hire the right amount of capital and labor so that they're not hiring in the region where the production goes down as they hire more and more workers. So I need to do two things here. I need to both kind of stall people from being vandals and cheats, right? I need to give them an incentive to put forth their maximum effort, but then I also have to get the right amount of stuff. What's the right amount of stuff then? What this is saying in mathematical terms is that the marginal product of labor over the wage rate which is essentially my price of labor, that the marginal product of labor over the wage rate is going to equal the marginal product of capital over the rental rate. What this means is that essentially if the workers are 10 times more productive than the capital, then they should get paid 10 times as much. The wage rate and the rental rate, the price I pay for labor, the price I pay for capital, should be reflected in how productive those inputs are. There's no such thing as unreasonable wages in this model. There's no such thing as unreasonable rates to pay for capital. Why do people pay a lot of money for for various athletes? No, athletes are earning based on their productivity, their ability to win games, to score goals, to get the 3-pointers, to do what they do to win the game. That would mean they're quite productive, and they should get paid a lot, right? And the person who owns the arena where it's done might not get paid as much. It might be because they're not that productive or contributing that much to the production of the output. And that's what we just see right here, right? Is that if I give you wage levels, then we should be able to attach those wage levels to the productivity of the workers themselves, so that we get a ratio such that maybe it looks like that I could then have a justification why a certain input is paid $5 an hour and a certain input is paid $25 an hour. There's a 5 times difference in compensation that's directly reflected in a 5 times different in productivity. This is exactly why this is important then for the manager to realize. They need to know how productive their inputs are in order to compensate those inputs properly. And we could just see this right here, although we've been doing this already. The production functions can have one of three forms. The first would be a linear production function, quantity of labor, quantity of capital. Here, I could have my labor inputs and capital inputs be substitutable to each other. Perfectly, I guess you could say. So here what I'm saying is that my production function, or what I'm graphing out here, what's called an isoquant, I could say, what are all the combinations of labor and capital that produce the same level of outputs? If it's a straight line, that means that labor and capital are perfectly substitutable to each other in terms of what this ratio is. The slope of this isoquant is the marginal productivity of labor over the marginal productivity of capital. In my Leontief, what I'm interestingly, curiously saying here is that my isoquants are now L-shaped. This is because the inputs are perfect complements. The guy who picks up the trash in my complex, there are two employees for one garbage truck. One guy drives the truck. The other one is to get out and like open up the the gate thing and like push the dumpster to the truck, and then the guy in the truck then like puts it into the dumpster, right? It's a pretty one garbage truck, two workers. That's the combination, right? Airplane needs one pilot, one co-pilot, right? So you've got two workers in the front for one plane. You could have extra people, right? You could have a guy sitting in the passenger seat in the garbage truck that just like, talks sports and, talks politics and gossip, right? But that guy's not adding to the production. So the problem there in this story I just told you would be the gossip guy in the garbage truck. It means I have an additional unit of labor, but no additional production. Or I could have two garbage trucks and two employees. That would mean that one garbage truck is actually being used, but the other one's just sitting in the parking lot because they've got no workers to be on it. I need a specific combination to make things work. And then finally we can have we can have the Cobb-Douglas function. And in my Cobb-Douglas function, which is much more familiar, the isoquants are curvilinear, which we've seen exactly as the shape of the indifference curve. So this shape should be familiar to you. These isoquants can be similarly shaped to indifference curves. Now, I could give you a production function then, and that's the point of this slide, is I could give you a production function, and obviously if I gave you units of the capital and the labor, you could just plug them in. I'm presuming that you're comfortable with algebra and that you know how to plug things in. What does this slide mean? What it means here is that when we're looking, that there's a relationship obviously between marginals and averages, that when the average is going up, the marginal, it's contributing to the, when the marginal is going up and it's above the average curve, it contributes to the average curve rising. And then when the marginal product falls below the average product then starts to fall. And we see that relationship existing for both linear and Cobb-Douglas functions. Now, what if I ask you then to calculate the marginal inputs, or the marginal productivity? Well, what you could do is just change the amount of the input, right? I could change it from having an additional unit of labor. I could solve the function with it having 15 units of labor, and then solve the function again when it has 16 units of labor, and see how much the total production changes by. That's going to give me my idea of how much the marginal product of labor is. What this gives us, this ratio of our marginal productivities, has a name. The formal name is called the marginal rate of technical substitution, MRTS. Seems pretty familiar to the indifference curve. So here's my isoquant. Let's compare these two together from the previous chapter to this chapter. In the indifference curve world that we looked at in the previous chapter, I talked about having two inputs. Or I'm sorry, not two inputs, two products that I could purchase, goods X and good Y. And along these lines, I described as having an ability to have constant utility across a certain line. What was called the indifference curve, where the utility was constant across it. And that the slope of this was called the MRS, or the marginal rate of substitution. Which was equal to the marginal utility of the good on the x-axis over the marginal utility of the good on the y-axis. This is different. Then now my isoquant. In my isoquant, now instead of the utility being constant, now I'm talking about production levels being constant. And what I'm saying here is that if I have quantity of labor and quantity of capital, capital spelled with a K because it was originally German, Kapital. So here's my output being constant, that the slope is now what we're calling our marginal rate of technical substitution. Which is equal to the negative of my marginal productivity of labor over my marginal productivity of capital. Look how similar these are. Your understanding of the previous chapter in terms of the indifference curve has the same logic for our understanding of the production side of things. Here, I was trying to describe how consumers make decisions. And that the decision that this consumer ultimately made would be right here. They would consume this bundle of the two goods because presumably there would be a budget constraint line that would touch this curve at one point. And now here's my optimal choice. Can you guess what the next thing I'm going to have to do here? Right, the whole point of Chapter 4 is now, how does the consumer make a choice? They make a choice by setting their budget constraint just tangent to the indifference curve. So how does the producer make a choice? I'm going to have to add a line here. And that line is going to be just like my budget constraint over here. So here's my budget constraint here. What we have here instead is something called an ISO cost curve, which essentially is my price of labor over my price of capital, or W over R, the wage rate over the rental rate. Price of labor is the wage rate, price of capital is how much I pay to rent it. Even if I own it, I'm basically renting it to myself. Look at what this does. It's going to be a point of optimality again. And it's going to tell you as the manager how much labor and capital to hire. You're going to hire the laborer where your ISO cost curve is just tangent to your ISO quant. And that's what we start to see right here. Now I can shift out the ISO quants further from the origin if I have more inputs. Right, this would just be saying that if I had more of both inputs, I could have more of the outputs. What you see along the ISO quant is that the slope is getting flatter and flatter. Essentially, as I hire more and more of an input, whether it's labor or capital, as I hire more of one input, I get less and less of an increase in the output. Essentially, either the slope is getting flatter and flatter and flatter, or steeper and steeper and steeper. When it's becoming flatter and flatter and flatter here, that means that it takes a whole bunch of inputs of labor to get more output, or the same amount of output. Here it takes a whole bunch of capital just to keep the same amount of the inputs, or the outputs. I already discussed this line. The ISO cost curve is just like my budget constraint. Here I just have a total budget levels, and then I have my wage rate, which is the price I pay for capital, or price that I pay for labor times the amount of labor that I have, plus the rental rate, which is the price I pay for capital times the amount of capital I have. That would be my total costs. It behaves rather similar to the budget constraint line. If I increase my budget, it shifts out my budget constraint line. If I change one of the input prices, it will cause pivots in my input. If I lower the wage rate, that's going to pivot out my ISO cost line. Where again the slope is right here. So obviously if this is falling, it would make this flatter and flatter and flatter, which is exactly what it's becoming. But then it would also change the intercept. Not the y-intercept, because nothing has changed in the y-intercept. This would be total cost over price of capital. Nothing changed in either of those elements for the intercept here. But here obviously it did, because total cost over price of labor, well obviously the price of labor fell. So now we can buy more of it. So here's my ISO cost line, which I've already drawn. Here, the budget is going up, so I'm shifting it outwards, parallel shifting it outwards if my total budget goes up, but the prices are not changing. And then obviously I could change the price of the inputs. If there was an increase in the wage rate, it will pivot inwards from the same capital intercept here. And there we go. Now we've got our optimal point. Our optimal point where the slope of the ISO cost, which is W over R, is equal to the slope of the ISO quant, which is the marginal rate of technical substitution, which is the marginal productivity of my labor inputs over the marginal productivity of my capital units, being equal to the slope of the ISO cost. Okay. Where are we seeing then that cost minimization? That cost minimization rule, we see it in this way right here. That, let's say I was producing at point A. The problem with point A is that I'm getting a certain amount of output and spending a certain amount of money. But wouldn't it be possible to be at point B, where it's just tangent? And look what I get. I spend the same amount of money because they're both on the same ISO cost line, but I get more production where they're equal. So when this is true, that the marginal productivity of labor over the wage rate is equal to the marginal productivity of capital over the rental rate, when they are equal, I am then minimizing my costs to produce that level of output. I am certainly not at point A, because at A, we can see here at point A that the slope of the ISO quant is steeper than the slope of the ISO cost line. I have too much capital, not enough labor. I need to adjust my levels of the inputs to get this amount of output. And that's the kind of discussion you see right here with this problem then, is that kind of adjustment that I just talked about. And it's the same point of discussion I just had right here, where I'm then having to adjust my inputs to be able to get more output and yet have it cost less. Okay, this will end part 1 for this chapter. And so let me just stop the video right now.